And joining us now is Dr. Alan Francis, who's a Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference works Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity, A Psychiatrist Analyzes the Age of Trump, now in an updated paperback version. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Alan Francis.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And later in the program, we'll be talking about the U.S. killing the leader of ISIS in northern Syria. And, of course, the U.S. is sending troops to Poland and Romania and Germany. And in general, we have a very powerful military that dominates the world. And we have something like 183 bases around the world. And we spend more money on defense than the next 10 countries, combined. And yet at home, we're very fragile. And what I find extraordinary, and this relates to your book, The Twilight of American Sanity, is that I'm worried about America's sanity, because this country is allowing a criminal who only cares about himself, not the country, to rip the U.S. further apart and even provoke a civil war to stay out of jail. So why are we tolerating our own destruction as we slide into this authoritarian one-party state led by this pathetic man who can't accept defeat because that would make him a loser? So he's taking the whole country down along with a large number of Americans who are his willing accomplices. So is America's sanity here in question? Because it sure seems that way.
Well, it no longer seems to be in question. I think we're seeing the vivid signs of insanity in everything from the support to Trump, the anti-vaxxer campaign, the conspiracy theories, the malicious bribing, the restrictions of voting rights. And to me, it's never been, since the Civil War, it's never been scary. America's always been an experiment. And after these 240 years, it seems like the experiment is failing. And it's failing without much external stress, not much economic stress. It's falling apart from within. Now, how could an idiot like Trump convince so many people that he's the second coming is one of the great mysteries that I don't pretend to understand. But I think that one of the important things to realize is that he's a symbol. He's not the disease. He's a symptom and a symbol of the disease, but not the disease itself. For the last almost 60 years, ever since Goldwater and the Southern Strategy and Nixon's pursuit of the evangelical Christian vote and the Southern white racist vote, ever since the Republican Party sold its soul to the devil, these last 60 years have witnessed a tremendous expenditure of money, brains, organizational skill, and ruthlessness to distort the truth, to convince the gullible, to threaten those people who are willing to stand up for democratic values. It's at every level. It's at the school board level. We're experiencing that where I live in San Diego. It's at the school board level, every part of the country. The school boards are now torn by vicious divisiveness, political jockeying, a lack of concern for kids, and a tremendous concern to further the goals of the Republican Party. It's happening in city council meetings and state assemblies. And this is really a coup. It's an anti-democratic coup. And the sad truth is it's succeeding. And Trump is the cheerleader of the coup. But I don't think he's solely responsible for it. It's a combination of a very gullible public, a very well-funded propaganda campaign on social media, talk radio, Fox News, and a power grab of the billionaire class that seems to be succeeding. And unless the reasonable elements of the Republican Party, if any, are left, unless the group of people who detest Trump realize that in supporting the Republican Party, at this point, they're supporting a party that's going to lead to autocracy. Not in the long run. This is something that's going to happen in the next decade. Unless they realize that their fate And the fate of American democracy depends on renouncing Trump and fighting against him. I think we're going to see a disastrous midterm election, a disastrous 2024 election, and a very, very quick slippery slope fall into autocracy.
So, Dr. Francis, what happened then to the Republican Party? Why did it go from the Chamber of Commerce sort of centrism and people like Bob Dole? You know, it wasn't that long ago that Orrin Hatch, the conservative senator from Utah, was best friends with Teddy Kennedy in the Senate. So what happened to turn that party into a bunch of junkyard attack dogs?
Well, the history here is it couldn't be clearer and more frightening. Part one is the John Birch Society, which started in the 1950s. They claimed that Eisenhower was a communist. They were at the radical extreme fringe. One of the 12 founders of the John Birch Society was the father of the Koch brothers. And what they have done with brilliance and ruthlessness, is turn the nation's agenda to the stuff they learned at home from their father and from the John Birch Society. So William Buckley, who was the father of American conservatism, renounced the John Birch Society, said they were nuts, said that they were a disaster to the Republican Party and to the country. And now, he was about as conservative as anyone could have been in the 50s. Now that John Birch extremism is at the very heart, soul, and leadership of the Republican Party. And the other part was the deal that happened after Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that the Republicans, Nixon in particular, seized on this as a way of destroying what had been the Democratic Party in the South, and played consciously and ruthlessly to the most radical elements of the religious right, to the most white racist groups in the South. Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for the 1980 presidency not far from where three civil rights workers have been murdered in Mississippi. He was declaring that he was on the side of the white supremacists and against the people who've been fighting for civil rights. So the Republican Party sold its soul to the devil and actually purchased, you could see it as a kind of free market purchased by the Koch brothers and other like-minded extremist billionaires. And we have to also realize that we have a very gullible public, that this is an example of a failure of public education, that many people are suffering, undereducated, unable to deal with the technical demands of this modern world, that globalization, which seemed like such a fantastic opportunity for the United States 20 years ago, is our undoing. Don't get what you wish for. Because it did lead, along with increased use of robotics and automation technology, it did lead to a tremendous constriction in earning power for people without education, and tremendous increase in inequality of rich and poor in this country. And the sad news is, I'm listening to a book now about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire fell because of climate change, because of pestilence, and because of great inequality between the richest and the poorest. Listening to how it fell in detail is sort of like a day-to-day reading of today's newspaper and consideration of what's likely to happen to us in the future. We're repeating history. We're not making it. We're repeating history. That as empires fall, it's usually tipped over the balance by climate change and pandemics, by economic inequality and poverty. And everything that's happened now has happened repeatedly before. And only a miracle, only an overshoot on the part of Trump and his allies, only if they become so ridiculously obvious in playing their hand, and only if everyone who is right-minded and sensible in this country realizes that we are in grave danger, enough to take part and to get their friends to take part, and to act as if this is the most crucial moment in the history of American democracy, which it may well be. If that doesn't happen, I fear for our children and our grandchildren, and for the rest of the world. Everyone's looking at us in other countries, wondering how we could be acting in such a foolish way, and realizing that if the United States comes apart, It will destroy efforts at pandemic control and climate control everywhere in the world. And the balance for our species now is in the hands of a very ruthless, very ignorant, and very selfish group of people who can bring the house of cards tumbling down.
And again, I'm speaking with Dr. Alan Francis, who's a Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. A psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now in an updated paperback version. So, I do get mail from listeners saying, stop the hand-wringing. What are we supposed to do? Well, I'm trying to find out what's happening. That's my job, to provide information to the public, not to necessarily have the answers, even though I'm looking for the answers. So given this prognosis that the country's its own sanity is now in question, that the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the podcaster guy Joe Rogan, these are the faces of America now. And you mentioned the stupidity of the anti-vaxxers, who, of course, one of their most prominent one is the Kennedy scion, etc. So given that you can just see the stupidity before you, the anti-intellectualism, the hate, and you've got this cheerleader of it all who's making this comeback or never went away, Trump, who's so clearly, even though he talks about America first, it's always been Trump first. And he's prepared to absolutely take the whole country down because he can't literally accept the fact that he's a loser. This is a sick man, but it's a sick country that is siding with him, at least a big chunk of it. So what is you mentioned some of the countervailing forces. Is there any kind of catalytic way that we can get a wake-up call, that the better angels can emerge? If the Democratic Party is as feckless as it appears to be, with this juggernaut of voter suppression, which will give the Republicans a permanent control of a one-party state, is there a possibility of a popular uprising? You've given us the diagnosis, so what's the cure?
Well, I don't think there'll ever be a civil war or popular uprising because the forces of darkness have all the guns, and we'll have a monopoly of state power if they succeed in winning the elections. It's a very bleak picture, but as Edmund Burke said 230 years ago, no man ever made a worse mistake doing nothing because he could only do little. And I think that at the local level, it's important that the school boards be protected, that the Republican systematic effort to take over school boards, and they use the dirtiest tactics, slurring opposing school board members, threatening them, using internet, ganging up procedures. But I think that good people have to run for school boards. Good people have to run for city councils. Good people have to support those who are running for school boards, city councils, state assemblies, state senates. We have to get out the vote. No one's going to be convinced at this point. I think that it's not as if the anti-vaxxers are suddenly going to say, grandma died and I realized the error of my ways. We've done that experiment. We have almost 1 million people dead, and it hasn't changed minds. That the conspiracy theories are so embedded in people's minds and hearts that the truth, even if the truth means losing a loved one, doesn't seem to get home. The conspiracy theories always find a new way of justifying what's completely self-destructive and selfish behavior. So people are not going to be convinced. I think it's a question of who gets to the polls. And even though the Republicans are doing their best to tilt the elections, if enough people realize that this is one that really counts, if the usual cynicism about government, I didn't get much out of this Biden administration, or they made this mistake or that mistake, and therefore I'll stay home, that attitude will lead to autocracy. It will lead to the worst kind of dictatorship. I think the Biden administration has been reasonably good under very difficult circumstances. I think that they're far from perfect, but who is perfect? The Biden administration represents America. It represents the history of this country, and it represents the future of our children living in a democracy. And you don't have to love everything it's done to realize that it's the last great defense against what would be very much the kind of country that we've seen around the world historically and in our current times, a country led by ruthless people who will take advantage of every possible avenue of power to gratify themselves and their patrons at the expense of everyone else. And everyone else will be frozen out and powerless. So I think that this election, it's actually elections because it's not just the presidential election or congressional elections, it's at every level of government, that these elections are fights for democracy. This is a time when people who are really patriotic need to reevaluate their values, need to realize that the Republican Party at this point is a party of dictatorship, need to get out to vote, need to spend their money on the cause of democracy, need to be soldiers for America at a time when America is in dire distress.
Well, Dr. Alan Francis, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
You know, my pleasure, and with sadness, Ian, I hope someday we can talk about happier things.
Well, we have to. There's too much at stake, and I thank you for joining us, Dr. Alan Francis, Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis, and his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity, A Psychiatrist Analyzes the Age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back examining the killing of the ISIS leader in Syria and get the latest news from Ukraine from a reporter who is a leading analyst of both theaters of